There we go. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining our discussion about GLBA safeguards and upcoming higher ed Department of Ed audits. So very excited to have all of you here today. And I'm going to now turn things over to our first speaker, Dean Forbes from Sidley, to dig in on GLBA. With that, Dean, are you there?
Great. I'm here. Can you guys all hear me?
Yep.
Well, okay. Well, good morning or good afternoon, everyone. My name's Dean Forbes. I'm going to run through a few slides over the next 20 minutes or so, and cover at the top, the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act Safeguards Rule in particular, and some of the application of it, and then we'll be followed by my colleague from the Department of Education, who will go through some of the more specific requirements. A moment. Try to advance the slides. Okay, so I'll first do, just introduce myself quickly. The Department of Education Publications on Protecting Student Information, which is why we're all here today, and the upcoming audits, and then talk a bit about the Privacy and Safeguards Rule. And what I thought might be interesting to this group, because some of the publications mention NIST, is to walk through some instances where the FTC has actually indicated that they've applied standards in their information security orders as those standards relate to NIST, and that basically, well, that the FTC's approach is consistent with NIST. Just a slide on my background. I worked at the FTC for a period of time and worked on privacy and information security matters, including the very first information security case, Eli Lilly. And I bring it up here only because that case is, I think, a great example of the first time that the FTC actually leveraged the FTC's, the GLBA Safeguards Rule for the type of respondent that was not typically covered by the GLBA, but to help put together requirements for a comprehensive information security program that Lilly and now I think 50 or so other companies are living under after several cases that have been brought since 2002. All right. So why are we here? The Department of Education has issued a couple of different publications on protecting student information. I think one was really just a follow-up from the first one on July 29th, 2015. And essentially, I think as this audience all knows, those publications related specifically to obligations of higher education institutions and their third-party service providers for obligations related to protecting data used in administering Title IV of the federal student financial aid programs. And what those publications indicated was that in order to support the Student Aid Internet Gateway enrollment agreement that each of the institutions had agreed to, they had to put in place certain standards and best practices for managing personal information and information systems and securing that information within those systems. And in particular, the FSA, or Federal Student Aid, required the institutions to comply with the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act. And under Title V, financial services institutions, which as they are defined under GLBA, would include institutions of higher education and would be required to ensure the security and confidentiality of customer records and information. And it announced in those same publications, I think in particular the latter one, that there would be a plan to audit these institutions for GLBA compliance. One other thing that was also pointed out was that the department strongly encouraged institutions to review certain standards under the National Institute of Standards and Technology for securing information as well. So each educational institution's agreement essentially includes a provision requiring GLBA compliance. And one of the things that these publications indicated were specifically that, like other financial services organizations, there are certain specific steps that the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act safeguards rule requires of covered entities. And essentially, one is to develop and implement a written information security program. And some of you might be familiar with requirements like this under state law. For example, the Massachusetts security law requires a written information security program, and many of your organizations likely already have such a program written and in place. But in addition to the program, you need to have an employee who's designated and responsible for coordinating the program. And you know, I think you know, in some cases, those may be one individual. It may be someone who is under the role of a chief information security officer. It could be someone who does not have that title, but has that role. In addition, identification and assessment of risks to customer information must be done, obviously designing and implementing the program, and selecting those service providers that are capable of maintaining appropriate safeguards, and then periodically evaluating and updating the program. And then the publications also mentioned that the education institution presidents and CIOs should have, at a minimum, done the following: evaluated and documented their current security posture against these GLBA requirements, and then taken immediate action to remediate any identified deficiencies. I think this is particularly important because it shows setting the tone from the top, and how significant in the Department of Education sees the role for senior leaders within these organizations to ensure and perhaps be accountable for these standards being in place. And then, as I mentioned before, the Department of Education is incorporating, or has incorporated, these standards into its annual audit guide, and would be in the process, as we'll hear with our next speaker, of starting these audits. All right, so let's dive in a little bit. For those of you who may not be aware, the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, or GLBA, also known as the Financial Services Modernization Act of 1999, requires financial institutions to explain their information sharing practices. Some of you may be aware that there is a privacy rule and a security rule, or the safeguards rule. Under the privacy rule, you're required to have particular notice that goes out or made available that would describe your information practices, what information you collect, use, or share, and also limit the sharing and disclosures of financial data with third parties, and also safeguard that the sensitive information that they may access. There's a requirement for initial and annual privacy notices under the privacy rule, and then options with respect to information sharing. Some sharing of information does not require an opt-out, and that may be sharing that's permitted by law, that's done for your own advertising or certain types of joint marketing initiatives. And affiliate sharing is regulated by the Fair Credit Reporting Act, or FCRA. It includes sharing transaction and experience information, sharing creditworthiness information, sharing affiliates marketing purposes. There's also clear disclosure, typically, of sharing with non-affiliates, and currently there's a new exception for the annual notice requirement, whereby would only apply if the financial institution has a no sharing policy, and applies only if the privacy policy is not changed from the prior communication. I'm going to go through these quickly because I think really the focus of this discussion is the safeguards. So Title V of the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act sets out a number of mechanisms, and I've gone over some of these, to protect the privacy and security of non-public personal information, or NPI, is referred to in the GLBA, that's collected by financial institutions. And it requires them to provide notices of policies and practices regarding disclosure of personal information, requires the prohibition of disclosure of such data to unaffiliated third parties unless consumers are provided the right to opt out of such disclosures, or unless other exceptions apply. And it's required that they establish safeguards to protect the security of personal information. For purposes of our discussion, we understand that the GLBA applies to educational institutions, but if you have any questions or you'd like to understand who it applies to more broadly, Section 313.3K addresses the definition of financial institutions and organizations to which the GLBA would apply. But generally, it applies to all businesses, regardless of their size, that are significantly engaged in providing financial products or services. And we'll go over now what steps the organization should take to comply. But essentially, reasonableness and appropriate security measures are what are required. Okay. The safeguards rule requires companies to assess and address their risks to customer information in all areas of their operation. Again, this is mirrored in several of the FTC orders requiring a comprehensive information security program. But here, there are three areas important to information security that were sort of identified by the FTC. Employee management and training, information systems, and detecting and managing system failures. Obviously, this is sort of an ongoing continuum in terms of how you manage all of this, because it's never ever a one and done. But the fact that these are three areas that the FTC has called out and that appear in several of the orders is significant and may provide some guidance to you as you're implementing on your program. But also determine what information is being collected, stored, and whether the business has a need to do so is important. Okay, I've covered some of this already. The GLBA safeguards rule requirements to develop the plan and what the plan should provide for, describing a program to protect customer information appropriate to the company's size and complexity, the nature and scope of its activities, and the sensitivity of the customer data that's being handled. And just like with the FTC orders, each company must designate one or more employees. So it may not be the CISO in title or the general counsel or potentially, other people within the organization. It could be more than one that would help to coordinate the program. Identify and assess reasonably foreseeable risks, the customer information, and addressing those risks in the relevant areas of the operations is keenly important. And designing and implementing the program and monitoring it. Following that is, as well as looking at the safeguards with third-party service providers and evaluating the program over time sort of forms the basis of the program. Examples of some reasonable security measures that you're likely already putting in place, but we want to confirm on an ongoing basis might include, checking the references or doing background checks of employees who will access customer personally identifiable information, or PII. Making sure that new hires agree to follow the security measures. Some companies might consider having someone sign an agreement to doing so, or simply attesting to a code of conduct or something to that nature. Limiting access based on a role. This is a common security principle. Access controls, including strong passwords, password activated screensavers, policies and procedures, including for mobile devices, training, reminding, awareness as well as the sort of the training or communication strategy that reminds employees of their obligations via emails or other means might be of some value. Consider a policy for telecommuters. Many of us work remotely and may still have access to the network, obviously, and those individuals should treat information securely wherever they are. Imposing disciplinary measures, or at least having some form of escalation policy for managing issues that may come up. Don't let terminated employees access information. Put in place a data asset inventory or data element inventory, securing data and storage, transmission, and destruction. It's I think, key to think about the whole information lifecycle in putting in place a comprehensive information security program. And obviously, finally, keeping security controls up to date. Those who may want to break into your system, or even just inadvertent issues that may come up, could maybe be tempered or possibly prevented by making sure that the security controls that you have in place are regularly reviewed and updated. I'm going to quickly jump into NIST, keeping in track of the time that we've got here, and the FTC's orders around information security programs that may be of some value to this audience as you're looking at your internal programs for information security. And again, I raise this for two reasons. One, the FTC has, since 2002, required several companies to put in place a comprehensive information security program that is based on the requirements of the GLBA safeguards rule, and secondarily because of the alignment which the FTC's pointed out in one of its blogs with respect to NIST. What you'll see right away, I think, is that there are similar requirements for respondents to orders, and obviously the FTC's 20-year consent decrees apply to those specific companies that are under order, but they typically require them to establish and maintain a comprehensive information security program, again, reasonably designed to protect the security, confidentiality, and integrity of personal information, and to put in place the types of administrative, technical, and physical safeguards that's appropriate to the size, complexity, nature, and scope of activities, and sensitivity of the personal information that might be processed, collected, used, or shared by the entity, and to, again, designate employees responsible, identify material internal and external risks, including, as I was mentioned before, risks that may be posed by inadequate policies and procedures or from lack of training, for example. Designing, reasonable safeguards, developing and assessing service providers, and then evaluating the program in light of the results from any testing and monitoring that you might conduct. In 2013, President Obama had issued an executive order 16636 that covers improving critical infrastructure cybersecurity. And essentially, it required NIST to work with stakeholders to develop a voluntary program or framework for addressing cyber risk essentially called the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. It comprises of 5 core elements: identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. The FTC, in a publication that it came out with recently, has gone through each of these 5 elements of NIST and aligned certain case law to those specific guidance pieces. And for the identify prong, basically it's certain FTC cases have alleged that companies have failed to take appropriate actions to assess security risks and develop plans to address them. i.e. take reasonable steps to identify vulnerabilities and threats to determine the risks to consumers' personal information. And for the organizations that are listed here, the FTC has pointed out that where those cases and those actions and order requirements for those companies have aligned to the NIST framework. Specifically for CVS, it aligns with the framework guidance on establishing an organizational information security policy. For HTC America, aligning with the framework guidance that companies should consider having a method of receiving threat and vulnerability information from information sharing. And as I go through each of these other ones, Protect is the next one. Certain cases of alleged company failures to develop and implement reasonable information security safeguards and practices. Twitter and Accretive Health are cases that the FTC has indicated have aligned with those that particular core function. Specifically for Twitter, guidance about managing access permissions or incorporating principles of least privilege and separation of duties, and for Accretive Health, guidance on protecting data in transit and formally managing assets through removal, transfer, and disposition of data. Under the Detect principle, we've got the Dave & Buster's matter, as well as the Franklin budget car sales matter. Both for the Dave & Buster's case, the FTC alleged that the company didn't use an intrusion detection system and didn't monitor system logs. And for Franklin budget car sales, the case, the FTC alleged that they didn't inspect outgoing internet transmissions to identify unauthorized disclosures. Both cases align to the framework guidance concerning monitoring networks for potential cybersecurity events and for unauthorized personnel connections, devices, and software. For Respond, again, similar to the other two areas, just wanted to point out that the FTC cases have challenged alleged failures to execute and maintain a reasonable incident response process or procedures, including breach detection. I'm not going to go into the details of these two cases in the interest of time, but as you can see, as we go through and sort of finalize this part of the discussion, that each of these core functions under the NIST framework, including the recover function at the end here, is illustrated through some of the FTC case law that exists. So with that, I think, Amelia, I'm going to wrap up. I think I'm pretty much at the end of my time, and I'll turn it over to the next presenter.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dean. Really appreciate all of that. In the chat, for anyone who has questions, I'm going to give you a minute to put a question in. And what I think we'll do, since we're running a bit behind, is answer questions around 12:20, 12:25, so that gives you all lots of time to do the questions. And yes, we will be sharing the presentation in response to a chat question, and also sharing the recording of the presentation. So with that, I am now going to turn things over to Tiina from the Department of Ed. Tiina, I'm going to make you a host, and you should be able to share your screen.
All right, I am sharing my screen now.
Great.
Let me just go into slideshow mode. Hello and welcome. My name is Tiina Rodrigue. I am the Senior Advisor for Cybersecurity for FSA. And I'm just going to go over some of the same information that Dean so adeptly covered and in just a little bit more depth. Primarily, the way we look at this is in assisting schools and helping them increase their security posture, but also in response to data breaches. And when we have this interaction, we are often asked several questions. And so part of what I've done to put together an agenda is bring those frequently asked questions to bear and make sure that you have a very clear idea of what the requirements are and what your role is in response to this. And so if there's any questions, I'll be happy to add them, answer pool further, and then we'll make sure that I also incorporate that into icap.ed.gov. So the first question I often am asked, well, who needs to worry about it? And I can tell you that when we're working with a data breach, the people that I contact first are the president and board of directors of regions. Those are the people who I work through program compliance in order to reach out if I have received a report of a breach. We do not always know if there is a CISO or if there is someone who's in charge of information security. Schools who have an information security program don't always proactively share that information with us. So that is why we work with the people we know of, and then they will work with their extended staff, whether it be the CISO, the registrars, the financial aid director, faculty and staff. And part of what we're concerned with is their data as well, including the data of everybody below them, to include parental data, user data, student data, applicant data. And so at this point, it should become very clear that we, much like the rest of the world, are concerned about any controlled unclassified information or consumer information in the terms of GLBA. Part of the reason why we're very concerned with this is because what we're finding with data breaches is that the schools themselves are often at this initial level of security maturity. And I realize this is a very busy chart, and Gartner was lovely enough to let me share this with you. But what we're finding is that schools, as they've also assessed, are at this highest level of risk. They often have information security as an ad hoc activity at best. There's very little executive awareness. The focus is on functionality and IT approaches as opposed to having a holistic program to make sure that all safeguards are in place. There may or may not be a CISO. There may or may not be a formal documented program, and users have individual knowledge, but not necessarily institutional knowledge. So part of what we're trying to do is to help schools get to that point of security maturity where they are in line with the financial services, and that they have therefore reduced their risk to what is a more manageable level, and get to that point where they are within their risk tolerance. And we realize that this can take schools years to do, although probably more than the 3 to 4 years that government organizations take to increase their maturity levels. But what we're finding is that we're working with schools who don't even know how to spell cyber, let alone take the steps necessary in order to increase their maturity. And part of the reason why this is so important is because the educational sector in particular could not be a richer trove of information. And what we're finding is that if schools do not appropriately respond to the first breach, which may or may not involve FSA data, they give them another bite at that apple, the second one almost invariably is. So the educational sector has a lot of capabilities. Even a .edu email has value on the dark web, but also the information, whether it's consumer information or the school's financial information, and the research data. These are all specific reasons why the educational sector is specifically targeted. And so we're working with you in order to try and get it to we're all safe. Because while we care very deeply about student data or applicant data, we also care very deeply about the schools and about FSA and about America. And this really has a common thread that is affecting us all. Apparently my participants need to upgrade to the latest version of Zoom to share their screen. So one of the things,
fine.
one of the things that Dean brought up is the fact that we are going to begin auditing for GLBA compliance, and this is true. We in fact tried to do this starting in FY17, and we're not able to get OMB to start, so it is now our goal to start in FY18, assuming that the administration allows us. And part of the reason why we're publishing this draft language is so that schools have the fullest opportunity to prepare for the audit, so that they understand specifically what we're looking for. And as Dean could tell you, this is straight out of GLB, and it's not even the full requirements that he so carefully went over. This is just the beginning. So making sure you have an information security program that's documented, and making sure that you have someone in the document who's annotated as the person in control, making sure that you're doing those risk assessments, and that those risk assessments are documented, and that you have created the program around those, and that you have the safeguards or controls in place to manage that risk is exactly what we're looking for. In FY18, we're not going to be auditing the monitoring, the testing, the third-party controls, things along that line. However, I would love to encourage you to start down that path as well, because this program will only grow over time. And so while we are starting with this tiny baby step that should have already been 15 years in the making, trust me that our expectations are that you will have the full program in place, and just not auditing to it yet. Some of this Dean has already gone over. So not only has the FTC declared that schools are financial institutions by education definitions as well, we have already established that they're financial institutions as well. So you have two areas of regulation, which says that if you're handling money and taking Title IV funding in, that you are a financial institution. These rules apply. Even if from a regulatory perspective they didn't, as already discussed, the schools, in order to be able to administer aid, also agree to comply with these rules. So sometimes during a breach, I will have schools who argue that they are not under this purview. I would invite you to save some time, because that just goes through a separate point where we will once again remind you of what you have agreed to. And I get it. I understand that in some ways the agreements that are signed are much like what happens when you sign for your mortgage. Not everybody reads every letter, or it's signed by someone who happens several years in advance. But it's very important that you understand that this requirement is in place, and we are going to be holding you to it, especially if you have a breach. And one of the things we're further seeing, and was just reiterated on August 31st by Secretary DeVos, is that if you are not administratively capable of handling Title IV funding, as evidenced by cybersecurity breaches, we will pull your ability to service Title IV aid. So this has already happened to at least one school where their cyber situation was so egregious that we no longer allowed their systems to connect to our system. And it is at the Secretary's discretion to permanently disable that as well. So you could be subject to all parts of subpart G enforcement actions, which includes fines, not allowing your systems to access it, to permanent disablement. And some of these safeguards were already gone over by Dean, so I don't want to beat the horse, but again, these are specifically what we're going to be looking for if you've had a data breach and you need to submit to us an information security program document. So if you do not have one today, this is specifically what we're looking for, and this is almost word for word what Dean has said. So, so while we may not be auditing to this standard, if you have a breach, you are required to produce this evidence that you have an information security program, and we will be looking for all aspects of it. So again, once again, could not be more clear in my encouragement that you have this established. And additionally, if you have a breach, one of the things that we're going to be looking for is your red flag rule program. And this is in many ways parallel to your information security program, but targeting specifically how you prevent identity theft and making sure that you can detect, prevent, and respond to it. So if we were doing this in person, a lot of times what I will ask the crowd is how many individuals have had a data breach, and more often than not, few to none hands will raise in the crowd. And what that is evidence of, for me, is not that there are no breaches, but that a school does not have in place any mechanisms to detect a breach. The Verizon report has given evidence to the fact that on average, a breach will last for 267 days before detection, and that many times the organization that has been breached is not the one that is becomes self-aware of that. So, and in fact, another study that I've read said that fraud detection systems typically work 6% of the time. That it is either other employees, law enforcement, or outside organizations that help identify that a breach or leak is in place. So making sure that what you do have in place is working is incredibly important, so that you at least catch some percentage of what is going on. And I really like the fact that Dean had already added the fact that the FTC is working with organizations to help them understand where they've fallen short, and we are doing the exact same type of effort with schools. So if you do not know what a breach is, we look at it as any unauthorized disclosure, misuse, alteration, destruction, compromise of information. So if you have a authorized individual who has a need to know and is appropriate to, but they're doing terrible things with it, the data, then that is still a breach, even if they were an authorized individual. If you have your data in an unsegmented hard drive that all student faculty can get to, then that would also constitute a breach, even if they all belong to the organization, because not everyone in the organization has a need to know. So focusing primarily on confidentiality, but also the integrity of the data, because you are making decisions on that. And so you're supposed to have in place administrative, technical, and physical safeguards in order to protect it. I cannot stress enough that cybersecurity and an information security program is not just technology. It is everybody's job. Everyone must play a role and understand what their role is with regards to it. I see breaches every day that are caused by registrars, financial aid professionals, by faculty who are because there either is no program or they're not following the program. Most of the time, technology will not save you and is not the answer. And as my colleague Dean pointed out, you have to have policy in place. But if you have policy with no enforcement mechanisms, then they're just suggestions. So making sure that you can do everything in order to protect the data and to protect it against other aspects of it is incumbent. I have had many schools argue that it was not a breach when in fact it is. Also, it does not have to be to a certain size. It doesn't have to be like Equifax with 143 million. Even one record is a breach. If you have an account that compromised, if that has the ability to access student individual data, say they clicked on a phishing scheme, that is a breach. It does not matter if it's digital or paper. If you have a car flying down the highway with paper flying out the back, that is a breach. And I cannot tell you how many times I have had that type of data breach report. I've had data breach reports where people are cross-stuffing envelopes. I've had data breach reports where someone has accidentally printed private health information on the outside of the envelope. All of those count as breaches. So, and it doesn't matter whether it's stored, transit, or in being processed. Your financial aid office or what have you should not look like the paper chase anymore. There should be no ability for people who are not authorized to access it. I got a question today about how do you securely receive faxes? And that once again is an important question, making sure, regardless of where it is, that the data is secure is your job. And as Dean pointed out, it's within the SAIG agreement when you're supposed to report it, and it is supposed to be on the day of detection. So if you wake up in the morning and someone suspects a breach, report it that day. Do not wait until it is confirmed. Do not wait until it is fixed. On the day of detection is when you are required to report it. And if you do not, then we have the ability to fine you for not reporting either. And we've already gone over some of the suggestions in the Dear Colleagues letters, but again, there have been numerous reminders and documents to tell you that this requirement is in place and we will be enforcing it. So if you don't know how to report a breach, it's relatively straightforward. Anybody can email us at cpssaig@ed.gov and we will take a report. It does not have to be someone in the official capacity. We take it from applicants, we take it from students, we take it from outside reporters, we take it from the media, we take it from anywhere we get it. US CERT sometimes reports schools for having breaches because there's data in the dark web. There's all sorts of places where we get information from. And if you are reporting it yourself, this is the information we suggest you incorporate. If you give me an information security program point of contact, and I'm typically the person who's doing this, then I will leverage that. If your system has been hacked to the point where you cannot email, which has happened, you can call us, and the phone number is 202-245-6550, and that's the EDSOC. They're open 7/24. They will take it, and if for whatever reason that does not work, their phone line is down, you can email me, call me, you can text me if you want. The text number is 202-279-0269. Pardon me, I had a tickle. And so those are all the various ways that you can contact us to do that. Now, while all of those things are in place to encourage you to do it, we also want to help. Hopefully. Don't you hate it when you have a tool and you just can't get rid of it? So we do have this tool that we have put in place, and we have borrowed it from FFIAC and automated it. And we encourage you to self-assess what your situation is, both from a risk perspective, talking about that red line from the Gartner, as well as your own cybersecurity maturity. Because it is from the Financial Institution Examiners Council, you may think, my school doesn't have any of this, but I can assure you, depending on the size and scale of your school, we have schools that do some, if not all of it. Maybe not one school doing everything, but some part of it. So you will be able to look at not just your technology, but all aspects of your school to see if you are at the level of a financial institution where you should be. And so that is there for you today. We've also worked with a public-private partnership in order to allow you to look at your privacy laws in your state plus GLBA and to look at your controls. So you would take your risk profile and where you are in terms of what you have in place from cybersecurity maturity, and then see if you have all of the regulatory controls in place as well. And that again is free today for you to log in. There is some premium content that you can also subscribe to, such as FERPA, and that you can look at both the domestic laws and international laws, because Title IV regulations apply to anybody who takes our financial support. And then, as brought up by Dean, we also have highly encouraged the use of NIST tools, specifically 800-171. When you download these slides, these are all hyperlinks in here so that you can get directly to them. But these are the various technical standards. If you don't know how to do them, or you don't know what the requirements are, or could be, these are the best practices. Last but not least, I am your person on the government side to help. So if you have a question, I am here to answer it. If you want a review of your documentation, it would not count against you in any way. If anything, I would personally give you a gold star for doing it. If you need help with the tools or how to use them, I am the person to consult with. If you have any suggestions or need anything, I will take that. So, and we have it all on the Cybersecurity Compliance page, everything that I've brought forward, so that you can share that with friends and family. And there again is my desk phone number and email if you need it. So your homework, because you can't go home without homework, these are your next steps. Find out what your information security policies and programs are. If you don't have them, develop them. Make sure that it includes the person and their contact information. If you have any questions about your risk assessments and testing, find that documentation. If not, create it, and then keep doing that on schedule. And then what we found to be beneficial for some schools is to publish it on an externally facing website, so that in case internal systems go down, they have it at least somewhere, and it's easy for you to find and maintain. And then with your executives, I have had the unfortunate circumstance where I was the first person to tell someone in the school that they've been breached. And it's not that no one in the school knew. I was just the first one to tell the president. That is not a good situation for anyone or their career. May I encourage you to make sure that your executives are fully briefed at all times, and that they are buying into the plan and keep it up. So that is the end of mine, and we can go ahead and take questions.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Tiina. That was really, really helpful. So going right into questions, both for Tiina and Dean, if you have any suggestions, how are schools supposed to implement these security measures, considering that many of them have limited resources, whether funding or staff, the appropriate IT professionals, And sort of related to that, our second question is, are the requirements any different for community colleges who certainly have much fewer resources than larger universities?
Dean, you want to take a crack at it, or would you like me to start?
I'll start because, while I haven't looked into specifically the issue of educational institutions, for the resource question that you've asked, I think it's important to point out that at least as it relates to the rule generally, that you're supposed to design the program that's based on your organization's size and scope, the type of data that you manage, and how it's addressed within your organization. And also, at least in the FTC's standpoint, they've pointed out, including in the recent enforcement actions, that some potentially relatively inexpensive or accessible security measures could have mitigated or prevented a particular issue that was identified by the agency. So it might be the perspective, and perhaps Tiina, you can confirm this, that the person who may be looking into this, or the agency, will look for those areas where when you look at reasonable and appropriate, it would apply to your particular circumstance, and also identify potentially places where, even with limited resources and budget, you might be able to put some controls in place that can have addressed or at least mitigated the situation. Tiina?
Absolutely. So, it's relatively straightforward. If we were in the room together, I would ask how many people have a lock on their front door. That is a physical safeguard. Making sure that you are clean and organized does not cost money. Making sure that you are taking the right steps to assess your risk are all relatively straightforward. Just as a quick answer, this applies regardless of the size of school, because we work with everyone from the largest organizations all the way down to the smallest barber schools, welding schools, and we have the same expectations of controlling their data for all of them. However, as Dean pointed out, we're not expecting every school to have $1 million solution. It would not make sense. A padlock isn't expensive. Making sure that you're taking the right steps to do it is just a question of mindfulness and forethought. A risk assessment can be relatively straightforward. And in fact, if you leverage the tools that we've offered for free, you could do it in under a day, I suspect, depending on how comfortable and familiar you are with it. There is all sorts of training available, both within the various nonprofit associations, and we will work with you for free as well. So my expectation is that with careful deliberation and with mindfulness, that you would go forward and look to see how this is being done in your organization, and realize that if you can teach others to do a topic, you can be responsible enough to manage that data. It is just as schools are required to be financially capable, and it is expected that you will manage the data with the same care and regard. And the reason why is simple. Data is people, right? If you are not careful with the data, you are not being careful with people. And that's what we're all here to serve.
Great. We just have a couple more minutes, so I want to get this question in for sure. What are the responsibilities of companies that have contracts with higher ed institutions? What should they be aware of, and what should they be helping their institutions on? Or alternatively, what should institutions be making sure is in their contracts with these companies?
Dean, do you mind if I start? So I can tell you for one case in particular, is that we would expect the contracts or any third-party servicers to follow all of these same requirements. and to point out that if you have outsourced something, it does not obviate the school from being responsible. The school still must be able to oversee, control, and monitor what is happening. So some of the obvious flaws I've seen in contracts, for example, since the SAIG agreement requires that you notify education on the day of detection, I've seen contracts written where the third-party provider has 2 days to notify the school. That would be an inherent conflict because the school will then potentially be out of compliance on each and every incident. I have seen situations where there was not a careful understanding of the contract, and the design, configuration, and testing were still the role of the school, but they didn't necessarily realize or read their contract, and so design, configuration, and testing were never accomplished. Obvious pitfalls. Anything that you see here as a requirement should be in your contract and should be explicitly spelled out, and then making sure that regardless of whose responsibility is it, that you have a quality assurance plan and surveillance in place so that you know that it's being done, because ultimately, even if you have outsourced it, it is still the school's responsibility to control the data and to know that it is being controlled. Dean?
Yes. The only thing I echo everything you've said, Tiina, and the only thing I might add is that, to look at this holistically, at least as it relates to not only obligations with the Department of Education, but, obligations under state law, obligations that also may exist to other stakeholders that you may have by virtue of the contract. If you are being required to notify the Department of Education the day of your discovery of the breach, then I would imagine that contracts with service providers should ensure that those service providers will inform you, promptly of anything that they may discover, so that the institution can appropriately report it to Tiina. And you may want to, and her group, and you may want to confirm with her what those expectations might be as you enter into or review your contracts. It may make sense to, put these particular agreements on some kind of a cycle to have them reviewed and updated as needed to ensure that you will be informed promptly or in a timely fashion of incidents that exist at third parties. And if you're at a third party, by the same token, you may want to ensure that the institution informs you of certain issues as may be needed based on your role, with respect to the managing of the personal information. So look at it holistically, recognize you may have obligations under state law and tolling requirements also to notify not only individuals, but potentially state attorneys general and others about the incident. And, work closely with Tiina and others at the DOE to make sure you understand the requirements.
One last thing I would add is, if for your contract, make sure, or as a third-party provider, make sure GLBA is the basis of how you're doing it. I have seen contracts where they have cited different or international standards as how they're going to supply it. That may or may not fulfill all of the obligations under what we expect. So just be clear of what you're doing.
Thank you. Dean, I know you had to run to your next thing, but Tiina, if you have one more minute, we have an important question here from someone. Could you really quickly speak to whether these requirements are relevant to state agencies that collect institutional data?
So state agencies such as, I'm not clear as to what you're asking. So there are already limits based off of HEA and FERPA what data is allowed to be shared. And specifically, you're not supposed to be sharing personally identifiable information with state agencies unless they are distributing aid or are part of that process. So there's already a limitation in place. If you need specific information on that, I would recommend that you reach out to the Department of Education's Privacy Technical Assistance Center. They work with whether or not data can be shared day in, day out, and I work with them on it. If you are already sharing data with the state, I would highly encourage you to review that to make sure that you are following HEA and FERPA requirements. There has been a lot of misunderstanding, and the changes that have taken place in the last 5 years have changed what you may or may not do significantly. But that would be a different webinar.
Wonderful. And with that note, thank you so much to Tiina, to Dean, for this really great overview. And again, as they both said, feel free to contact them if you have more questions. We'll be distributing notes from this webinar as well as the recording afterwards. And thank you again to all of you for attending.
Thank you, Amelia. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Tiina.